Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Crosshair VII Hero. Now, before we get into all the power delivery details, I'm just going to highlight some of the overclocking features that this board has.
Before that, this is brought to you by the MSI GTX 1080 Gaming X and NVIDIA's GeForce Experience, which allows you to retroactively capture key gameplay moments with shadow play, convert captures into GIFs with new tools, and apply filters to games, #NoFilter. MSI's Gaming X PCBs are high quality with well-built power management and coolers that we've previously recommended. Learn more at the links in the description below.
On the integrated rear I/O, you can find the clear CMOS as well as BIOS flashback button. It's in this area, so you can actually flash your motherboard with no CPU, just a 24-pin plugged in, and it'll flash off of the 5-volt standby power of your power supply. So that's a pretty cool feature, especially handy if you've like it can recover from like corrupted BIOS flashes, and so that's that. The motherboard does have an 8-pin and a 4-pin for CPU power. For those of you unaware, the 4-pin is completely optional. In fact, the way these work, you could probably just plug in the 4-pin and not the 8-pin. It would be a terrible idea to do that, but it would probably turn on. But you really do just, for daily usage, you really do just need the 8-pin. And even on liquid nitrogen, I wouldn't be surprised if you were fine with just the 8-pin. The 4-pin really shouldn't make much of a difference under any conditions. Now then, moving along the top edge, up in the corner here we find the postcode as well as some troubleshooting LEDs under that. The postcode is of course extremely handy if you're trying to troubleshoot any kind of boot issues, because it tells you with a pretty good amount of detail what exactly went wrong. The LEDs below that they're color coded, and they're not as helpful in my opinion, but they are a good quick indicator of what is malfunctioning, even though the postcode will always give you a better amount of detail. So you basically just check the postcode and then check the motherboard manual for what that code means. So yeah, that's postcode's much better than the LEDs, but it doesn't hurt to have both. And if you're just trying to quickly figure out what might be wrong, then the LEDs are a good first indicator. Now then, under that you find the power button and the reset button. So one turns your computer on and the other one just resets it. So no rocket science right there. You can't see it in this picture, but there's voltage read points right along here. They are well, here you can see them better, so that's the actual voltage read points. They are next to the 24-pin, which I think is probably the worst place to put them in terms of accessibility. Because, well, it's just kind of hard to get probes from a multimeter under the 24-pin cable that'll be, plugged into this area. The vCore DRAM and SoC voltage read points have an upgrade to them in terms of signal integrity. So they're actually differentially routed this time around, and that basically means that they'll pick up less noise and they'll be more accurate when you try to probe them. And also, while we're on the back of the board, you can see right here there is a hole in the socket, and this is for putting a putting a thermocouple through for extreme overclockers to basically monitor the temperature of their CPU, because the built-in CPU temperature diode does not work at well, basically below minus 20 degrees. It is completely useless. Even below minus 5 degrees, the diodes often just stop working. So very, very, this is a handy feature, though. I as a, extreme overclocker, I've never actually used it. I can see the point of it. I can imagine there might be some scenarios in which it could be helpful, but generally speaking, I've never used it. Most other people I know have never ever used it. But for those, for those who want to use it, it's there, and that definitely doesn't hurt to have it. So that's another one of these features that the board has. Now then, going down along the edge, you don't really find anything for a while until you get down here, and this is my first major complaint for the motherboard. Don't do this. Just like don't do this. Don't put 2 control buttons up here, 2 controls buttons over there, and 2 more, and like another bunch of controls down here. Like, that's just it makes it really, really hard to sort of have an optimum orientation for the board, because like if you're comfortable, if you have easy access to this, then you won't have particularly easy access to that or this if you're on a test bench. So I completely understand why they've done this, because this board isn't an EATX, so it does actually, like ASUS for a lot of the other top-end ROG boards, they're like a bit wider, and that's mostly that allows you to accommodate all the extra buttons up in the corner here. But yeah, this is just not, this ruins quality of life when overclocking. And so basically your safe boot button and your retry button are down here. The safe boot, you press that, and if you have bad BIOS, like if you're having trouble posting because you've screwed up some settings, you hit safe boot, you get into the BIOS, and all of your settings are still there. You've just booted on stock settings. So that's a really, really handy feature for those of us who don't keep good track of saving profiles. If you're good at saving profiles, the clear CMOS is all you really need. But this is way more convenient because you don't need to save profiles. And yeah, so that's a really nice button to have. Next to that, there's the retry button. The retry button is for if you have very difficult memory settings. You can press the retry button a few times to basically force the motherboard to try retrain the memory settings. And, well, it's a good way to try get hard memory overclocks working. It's not exactly, this isn't something you would use for daily overclocks, because restarting your computer, like, several times to get your memory to post properly, it probably means that your memory isn't stable even once it does post. So this is very much for benchmarking purposes and not for daily usage. Next to that, you find the LN2 mode jumper. It kind of varies how much this does depending on the motherboard. But without LN2 mode enabled, the slow mode switch under that doesn't work. But also your BIOS voltage limits aren't as ridiculous as they could be. Because normally an ROG motherboard has BIOS voltage limits that are completely unsafe for, long-term usage. Like, you can set like 1.6 volts to the CPU, 2 volts into your memory, 1.4 volts into your SoC. Like, completely ridiculous amounts of voltage are already accessible without the LN2 mode. If you go into LN2 mode, everything gets bumped up by a couple hundred more millivolts, so you go from not particularly safe for use as is to definitely not safe for daily usage at all. And arguably not even safe on liquid nitrogen. It, basically unlimited voltage mode. More voltage than you could ever possibly want. Below that, you do find the slow mode switch, which does require the LN2 mode to be enabled to work. And what the slow mode switch does is it forces the, if you turn it on, it forces the CPU ratio to the lowest possible setting. If you turn it off, it puts the CPU back up to its current speed. So very, very handy for extreme overclockers, because if you're just sitting in the BIOS, you don't need the CPU running at 5 gigahertz or 5.5 gigahertz or whatever you've gotten it to. Similarly, if you're in Windows and just, setting things up or making a screenshot or doing any, or preparing things, there is, again, no reason to have the CPU running at 5 gigahertz, and you can force the CPU to a much lower frequency using the slow mode, which, A, ensures better stability, and B, it actually saves you liquid nitrogen, because not running at full speed all the time does mean the CPU doesn't, you're still going to be at high voltage, but the massive drop in frequency does actually significantly lower your power consumption, so it also lowers your liquid nitrogen usage. So that's a very, very handy feature to have on all extreme... I think this is a must-have for most extreme overclocking motherboards that have a, high power consumption architecture available to it. So, X99, X299... X399, X470, X370, all of these should have the slow mode, because these CPUs can idle on a lot of power if you let them. And idling on a lot of power is not good for basically your LN2 usage. So that's definitely a nice feature to have. And that pretty much covers it in terms of the really obvious stuff that this motherboard has in terms of extreme overclocking features. It does also support BCLK overclocking, though we'll not cover the details of that here. And yeah, it doesn't have a dual BIOS. It is a single BIOS motherboard, as was the previous Crosshair Hero board. So yeah, which personally I prefer having motherboards with dual BIOS, but well, no, I just straight like it's just better to have a backup BIOS built into the board than not have one at all. And the other thing is the BIOS chip on this motherboard isn't even socketed. So you have one BIOS chip, and if that one BIOS chip fails for whatever reason, it pretty much needs to get like removed and replaced by soldering. Not great. So yeah, that is like the BIOS flashback function should be able to recover you from like 99% of, various BIOS failures and corruptions, but if there's something actually straight up wrong with the chip, then the lack of there being a second chip or just the ability to remove it is kind of a problem. So yeah, I do prefer, like, I think for a board in this price category, it really should have a second BIOS. It doesn't really make sense to just have one, especially because BIOS chips aren't exactly expensive, and in the past, a lot of ROG boards had dual BIOS, so I don't know why they stopped doing that so much these days. Anyway, let's get into the power delivery system now. ASUS have done some interesting things with the VRM this time. Well, one interesting thing with the VRM, other than making it just more massive, like other than making it massive overkill, there's one interesting thing they've done. So this right here is your vCore and SoC VRM, because the way it's actually laid out is kind of funky. So that right there is your SoC VRM. This is vCore, right, vCore, and this down here is also vCore. And the reason why this is done is because this motherboard does not have any display outputs. So there's no good reason to put an APU in it, and even if you did put an APU in it, you can't actually use the APU's GPU to do anything. So the SoC VRM on this motherboard will basically not have to do any work, because it's never going to be running a APU. So ASUS decided to put the SoC VRM between the vCore and the other vCore for basically thermal purposes, because it means that instead of having one big, hot blob like this, you get one hot blob down here and one hot blob down there. And overall, your temperature is actually like your overall thermal density is a bit lower because you have this cold spot in between the two rather than just having one big hot stripe like that. So that helps improve VRM temperatures. The actual VRMs themselves for vCore, you're looking at a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 phase, and the SoC is a 2 phase, like that. The voltage controller is on the back of the board, which is kind of an interesting place to put it. Most boards have it on the front, but I guess since they already had SMDs going on the back of the board anyway, they decided that, well, just doing more work on the back doesn't really raise the cost, because obviously if you just do one side of the board, it's cheaper than doing both. So the voltage controller that ASUS uses for the vCore and SoC VRM is this chip right here, and it is the ASP1405. So that is an ASUS rebranded part from International Rectifier. It's probably an IR, IR 35201, so the same thing you would find on all the other high-end motherboards. It might have some special features specifically for ASUS, but with all probability, it's just probably like it's almost certainly just a straight rebrand. Here it is running in a 5+2 phase configuration. The 2 is for the SoC. The 5 runs into a bunch of doublers, in this case IR 3599s. So the dumbest doubler that IR makes, because this thing literally just... So those are IR 3599s, and that gives you a 10 phase. By the bare minimum definition of what a 10 phase would be. And the reason, somebody pointed out last video that I'm less harsh on these doubling schemes, and it's basically because a doubled up 5-phase has more in common with a 10-phase than it has with a 4-phase or a 5-phase. Like, it is a lot better than just a straight 5-phase. But of course, having like a 10-phase or even a real 8-phase, those might have an advantage over it, but it's not comparable to a 5 if it's doubled up into a 10. So the 3599 literally just takes the PWM signal from the ASP1405 and cuts the switching frequency in half and puts it into 2 phases. So this thing does have 10-phase interleaving, so 1 phase out of the 10 is only ever turned on at the same time, which means you do get all the benefits, like you have lower ripple, and you have better thermals on the VRM and better efficiency, but the VRM does lack things like current balancing, because the IR3599 is incredibly dumb. It doesn't even do the most basic current balancing of like turning off, like skipping a phase. And it can't do duty cycle extensions, which some of the really expensive doublers can do. But it does do the bare minimum of that. You know, you only do have one out of the 10 phases running at any given time. So, and your transient response is also better than like a comparable 5-phase. So it is close enough to being a 10-phase that I'll go and say it's a 10-phase. Because it doesn't really deserve to be lumped in with the other 5-phase designs there. So, that's the control scheme here. The SoC is just a straight, 2-phase running off of the ASP1405. Now, if we go back to the front of the board, the actual chips making up each phase, well, the chip making up each phase, because it is one chip. These are international rectifier power stages. These are IR3555s. The ASUS favorite 60 amp power stage. These are actually surprisingly cheap, apparently. Like, you can get these on DigiKey in a reel of 3,000 for $2.17 a piece. So I'm not sure what's up with that. I think they're on like a massive sale, because I'd expect these to cost a lot more under normal circumstances. But yeah, they're currently going for $2 a piece. So they're cheaper than than what I'm like. I expected to see them around $3 to $4. So yeah, but right now these are cheap, which kind of explains why ASUS has been using them so much, because this is like they've been throwing these on so many boards recently, and graphics cards. And well, it's a 60 amp power stage. So the end result is that this is massive overkill for a Ryzen 8 core. Like, it's ridiculous how overkill this VRM is. So if you're looking at running, so with this VRM running at 500 kilohertz switching frequency on the actual phases, so that would be 1 megahertz coming from the controller, and 5-volt gate drive, for a 8-core, like, I'm just going to go with the 1000 series 8-core and the 8000 and the 2000 series 8-core CPUs, because well, they're the highest current draws that you're going to see on a AM4 motherboard. So for the 1000 series at 1.42 volts, you'll be looking at around 100 amps, and for the 2000 series, you're going to be looking at 1.42 volts and about 125 amps. And with these, with this operating configuration for the VRM, you're at 100 amps, you're looking at about 12 watts of heat, which is very similar to what we saw in the Gigabyte Gaming 7. And at 1.4, at 125 amps output, you're going to be looking at 13 watts of heat, because it's just completely massive overkill. This VRM doesn't need a heatsink at all. Like, the Gigabyte one didn't. This is even more efficient. These components are physically larger. This thing will run ice cold under basically any operating conditions. It's massive overkill. And if you if you crank it up to liquid nitrogen, which I don't have accurate power figures for liquid nitrogen yet, but 1.85 volts, and I think the CPU might hit 200 amps. I'm not 100% certain about that, because very low temperatures massively change how much power a CPU pulls, and by massively change, I mean massively reduce the amount of power a CPU pulls. So I'm not sure if it'll even hit that much current draw. It might go above that, it might go below that. I'm thinking probably below that. But for 1.85 volts, 200 amps, this VRM will only produce about 22 watts of heat, which is just like, it's ice cold. Like, that is still, you know, spread across this many phases, 22 watts of heat is really not much. So, yeah, that is, this thing is massive overkill. It's just absolutely massive overkill. Then again, that's like, with the price tag that this board comes with, it makes sense that it would be. So, yeah, very, very impressive VRM from ASUS. Also for temperature monitoring, since people are wondering about that, the temperatures on this VRM are read directly from the IR3555s. They have a temperature monitoring function built into them. So, that's how that's taken care of. And, yeah, that's like, probably that's one of the most accurate ways to get VRM temperatures possible, directly from the power stages, because that temperature sensor is actually built into the silicon that's doing your switching of that's actually in the same silicon as the MOSFET. So it has the least amount of thermal resistance towards the things that are actually getting hot. Now, the SoC VRM is made up of the same 3555s, so it too is ridiculous overkill. And for about 1.2 volts, 20 amps output, which is probably around the max you will see for a CPU Ryzen, you're going to be looking at about 2.2 watts of heat. And for 30 amps at 1.2 volts, you're going to be looking at about 2.4 watts of heat. There's no point rating this for like SoC current draws of an APU, because there's no display output. So no good reason to put an APU in this board. The SoC VRM is, again, massive overkill. It's just, this is kind of everything about this board, really. Well, about this VRM right here is best described as massive overkill. So I can't complain here. In fact, what's kind of interesting about this VRM right here is it's technically bigger than what you would get on some other top-end ROG motherboards on, let's say, power-hungrier platforms. So, yeah, this, I'm pretty sure, is currently the strongest VRM from ROG that you can get on a motherboard. Like, I don't think they have a board with a stronger VRM than this. They do have GPUs that have had stronger VRMs than this, but not motherboards. So this is actually really close to their top-of-the-line GPUs in terms of like the VRM design, which is which just like the reason why GPUs get so much stronger VRM designs is because GPUs are like have a stock power consumption of like 250 watts. Right, whereas a CPU at stock is like 100, and if you overclock a GPU, you can easily do as much as double the stock power consumption, and on CPUs you can do roughly the same, but a CPU going from 100 to 200 watts is nothing compared to a GPU going from 200 to 400 watts. So yeah, this really wouldn't look out of place on a 1080 Ti. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, this is very, very, very similar to what the ASUS 1080 Ti Strix has for its V-Core VRM. So, yeah, this is ridiculous overkill for a Ryzen 8 core. But hey, for a price, for a motherboard at this price point, I mean, it better be ridiculous overkill. So, yeah, nothing to complain about the actual VRM itself. The capacitors around the motherboard, so these guys and these are Nichicon FP series, and you can actually tell that these are FP10Ks. So these are rated for, oops, wrong button. These are FP10K Nichicons, and that 10K stands for 10,000 hours at 105 degrees centigrade. I mean, Celsius. So, and I keep doing that wrong, so there. So yeah, these are basically the only higher rating I've ever seen on a motherboard is 12,000. And honestly, if you're not hitting that 105 degree figure, the time that these capacitors last is like orders of magnitude larger than that rating at 105 degrees. Like if you're at 80, they last for ages and ages and ages and ages. So yeah, this like you should not be. The CPU will probably be obsolete before these capacitors and this VRM hit their like mean time to failure. So yeah, nothing in the power, like in the CPU power section to complain about. For the memory power, ASUS has gone with the ASUS usual of 2-phase memory VRM. It's this thing right here, and these MOSFETs. So these are discrete FETs, and these are Nyko semiconductor, and yeah, this is a really cheap MOSFET manufacturer. But the thing about RAM is that it doesn't really pull about power, pull all that much power. So these Nyko PEA 16BA MOSFETs, even if you have 4 memory sticks pull at 1.35 volts, pulling 2 watts each, which is actually a bit high for that voltage, you know, you're going to be looking at 6 amps output on this VRM Max, and that'll produce about 1 watt of heat. So this isn't overheating. And ASUS has been using this memory VRM design on tons and tons of boards because it works. So yeah, that covers the memory VRM right there, and that covers actually the entire board. I mean, you do get some minor voltage regulators down here, but none of those is, you know, you're not going to be changing the voltage outputs of any of those, so there's really no need to worry about their about them. And yeah, that covers the board. Like my only complaint is that they put they put some of the controls down here and then some of the controls up here. I find that absolutely infuriating when a motherboard does that, because I use these buttons a lot, and when they're this far apart, it really gets, you know, it starts getting on your nerves after the 50th time you need to go press the safe boot button, and it's on the other end of the motherboard, which you can't reach. But other than that, like this board is extremely solid, massive amounts of overkill on the VRM. It's just, yeah, it's a pretty heavy upgrade compared to the old Crosshair VI Hero, actually. Like, you get, not only do you get 2 phases more than before, all of the MOSFETs were actually, like, just upgraded. It went from the Texas Instruments Power Dual NFETs to these International Rectifier 3555s, and that's just another massive upgrade. So, yeah, it really, like, this is the strongest VRM that I'm aware of that ASUS has on motherboards right now. So yeah, that should pretty much tell you everything you need to know. This thing is massive overkill, and there's as long as the BIOS is good, there's not really any way that this I could see this motherboard letting you down. Physically, there's nothing wrong with it. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below if you have or any questions. If you'd like to support what we do here with Gamers Nexus, there's a Patreon link and shirts you can buy. You'll find a link down in the description below for that. And if you'd like to see more overclocking content and PCB breakdowns, things like that, I have my own channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking. It would be awesome if you would check that out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.